from this space up the stairs and around the balcony, it really mimics a whaling voyage around the world. The first stop would have been the Azores, and so this is actually from our panorama. Piku would have been the first stop because remember it ran from right to left. You would see Piku in the distance, tall mountaintop, and then you'd know you finally got out of the Gulf Stream and you hit the Azores. This is the island of Horta, and this diorama is actually a model of the port, so you're supposed to imagine you came off the ship and here you are, right, with the fresh produce and trade going on, and then you could go off sort of on your own and enjoy some leisure time. Another important thing about this port, Horta, which is on the island of Fayal, in 1958, there was a volcanic eruption on the island, and Senator, at the time, Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, Senator Pastore of Rhode Island, thought that it was really, really important to give displaced Azoreans a refuge. And so the Azorean Refugee Act was signed, and the quota for Azoreans was raised from, I might have the numbers off a little bit, but it was something like 2,000 to 20,000. And so we see another big wave of Azorean immigration after 1958. But it was this same island that we're looking at here. The other thing that's worth mentioning is the capote, the cape that the Azorean woman is wearing. It's actually Flemish in origin, but was adopted by Azoreans. And it's something that would protect women from the wind and the rain and give them some degree of privacy as they were doing their daily business. And so a lot of people find just the shape of that really neat. So we're still in the Azores at this point. This here is a vigia, right? And so these would be placed on tops of hills or on tops of mountains, and someone would sit in here all day with a telescope looking for whales. You see a whale, you yell out, "Balea, balea," and all of the men in the village within earshot drop what they're doing, farming or playing cards, whatever they're doing stops, they run down to their boats, push them into the water, row out, harpoon the whale, row back in. All of the adolescent boys are on shore, ready to do the processing, and then the whale is divided. Now, sort of blurs the line between commercial and subsistence whaling. So when you think about the history of Azorean whaling, it was to sell the oil. However, the oil was sold to support farms. So in a way, it was subsistence driven. So here we have some drawings from a book that is no longer in print called Twice Round the Loggerhead, which talks about the process of Azorean whaleboat building. Although you see things drawn out here, the really significant thing about Azorean whaleboat building is there are no sketches done beforehand. Right, it's built, I mean, that's how skillful the boat builders are. Important family and government relationship between the US and the Azores. If you think about how significant whaling was to our nation, so at the time, probably the most profitable industry we had next to slavery, and also one of the only global industries we had, it was really important that in places around the world where we had an economic interest, we were also represented and our assets protected. And so one of the earliest consulates was established in the Azores, and I think it is the oldest surviving consulate to this day. And so the Dabneys had 3 generations of men in their family that served as American consuls in the Azores. And so this case is dedicated to them. Here we have some traditional Azorean craftsmanship. So weaving cloth, which Azorean women did, and the spinning wheel, some carving into scrimshaw and bone, really important. And if you look at these 2 little figures here, they're the women in the capotes. And then finally, we get to contemporary Portuguese culture. But every summer in New Bedford, there is a Day of Portugal. And often what happens here on Day of Portugal is traditional Portuguese dance in the plaza. And so we have an example of traditional Portuguese dancer dress, in this case, a mandolin, which is a really important instrument. And when we think about Portuguese influence around the world, whaling is one way to think about how extensive Portuguese influence was, right? One of the largest empires ever. On a whaling voyage, you leave New Bedford, you come to the Azores, Lusophone, right? Portuguese speaking. You go to Cape Verde, next, Lusophone, Portuguese speaking. You go back across the Atlantic to Brazil, Portuguese speaking, right? So there's this entire diaspora of Portuguese speaking people. Really points to the significance of the Portuguese Empire at one time. Some religious symbolism, religious iconography, very important. The first Portuguese parish in this country was St. John the Baptist here in New Bedford. The original burnt down and was rebuilt, I think, 1908. And then was closed because we are within the Diocese of Fall River. Because of attendance, it was closed in 2012, but really reflects the overall decrease in ethnic parishes around the country because of demographic shifts. Hydrangeas, right? So if you've ever seen images of the Azores, you've seen these beautiful hydrangeas. They just prosper on the islands because of the volcanic soils. They are illegal to pick there, so it's a look but don't touch. But we thought it was really important to have that symbol there as well as the arch, right? And these stones, I should say, this gallery, this Azorean Whaleman's Gallery, was funded in large part by the government of Portugal, right? And they also paid for these, which if you see houses in the Azores, a lot of them are made of this sort of volcanic stone. This is real volcanic stone that was also purchased for us by the Portuguese government. So again, as it would be on a whaling voyage, we're leaving the Azores and we're going to head to Cape Verde. I'm sure here in New Bedford, everyone knows where Cape Verde is. Everyone's heard of Cape Verdeans. Not so in other parts of the country. I think I could say the same thing for Portuguese. Not a lot of, they'll say, oh, is that a part of Spain, right? Or if you say you're from Cape Verde, oh, is that in the Caribbean? But here, it's really a significant story tied to whaling. And then even after whaling, the migration did not stop. It continued. And so in this first case here, we have a little bit of traditional Cape Verdean culture. On the left, though I know everyone back there can't see it, take a peek when you're coming through. Pano cloth, traditional Cape Verdean cloth that was used for everything from carrying babies while you were doing work to, in times of scarcity, it was also used as currency, right? Really important. This sculpture here is a model of the slave pillory in the town of Cidade Velha, which means old city. In Portuguese. It was the first subtropical colony in the world, 1462. And if you think about where Cape Verde is located, 400 miles off the west coast of Africa, this was the depot for the transatlantic slave trade. We've got some traditional grinding, mortar and pestle type vessels. Salt from the island of Sal. So one of the really important things for whalers was to be able to preserve meat in salt. And so Sal, still to this day, has a significant number of salt mines. Really important stop. This here, which you can barely see, but is always a crowd pleaser to explain, this little bead on the necklace, it's called a contradoge, against the eye. It's very similar to the protection against the evil eye that you see around the Mediterranean. And so the belief is that the white dots on the bead absorb energy, negative energy. And if you're getting a lot of negative energy, it'll crack. And that's how you know you need to get away from the people or circumstances you're around. Today, Cape Verdeans wear them as jewelry, but traditionally you would pin it to a baby's diaper. So most Cape Verdeans came in through New Bedford. I think up until the next wave of immigration in the 1980s after Cape Verdean independence, 70% of Cape Verdeans came in through New Bedford. So it's known as the Cape Verdean Ellis Island. And you see it on that panel there. But one of the things that is significant to note is as the 20th century came about, whaling was declining. There was a really awful wreck in the Arctic in 1871 that sort of did the whaling industry in, kept moving along slowly, but the grounding of the bark Wanderer was effectively the end of the whaling industry. But as the 20th century came about, fewer and fewer white males wanted to engage in whaling. The work was dirty, the work was dangerous, and there were just other opportunities. So, Cape Verdeans and Native Americans were now the bulk of whaling crews, and often whaling captains as well. Azoreans were continuing to whale as well. But even after whaling ended, many of the whale ships were converted into what are known as packet ships. So these ships would go from New Bedford to Cape Verde and back, carrying goods and carrying people each way. And so that was the new method of migration to New Bedford after the whaling industry was done. And we're actually, one of the most famous of those packet ships, the Ernestina Morrissey, was given to Cape Verde, and I should be saying Cabo Verde. That's the correct way to say it. I'm trying to shift. Right, my family is Cape Verde, and I've grown up saying Cape Verde. There's been a new movement in recent years to go to the correct way to say it, Cabo Verde. I slipped back into the Cape Verde when I shouldn't. The Ernestina Morrissey was given to Cabo Verde. It was on the island of St. Vincent, in really, really bad shape. And so they gave it back to us so that we could repair it and get it back to being seaworthy. It is currently in Maine at Booth Bay. And so this case, again, really dedicated to Cape Verdean whalers and whalecraft. Here, we have some photographs. I mentioned the bark Wanderer and how the grounding in 1924 effectively ended the whaling industry. So these are images from that ship and that voyage. I put this in because it's cute, right? It's a baby in a tub liner, sort of hanging as if it were a hammock. Pretty noteworthy crewman, first mate Joaquin Joseph Gomes, who is right here in this picture. They were on board in 1924 when the ship ran aground. It was an all Cape Verdean crew. This picture here, the man harpooning, is actually my own great-grandfather. I was putting together the Cultures of Whaling exhibition and looking for some photographs and saw a picture of this man's face and said, oh, I know who that is. And so much like with the Azorean exhibition, we end with a modern, sort of contemporary Cape Verdean story after leaving the whaling industry, maritime industries. The military was an option. Cranberry bog work was actually the next sort of most Cape Verdean area of employment. And so we were given a cranberry scoop to represent that. Judge Layton, who has a panel here, and we actually did a show in his honor last summer, an art show, he was the first federal judge of Cape Verdean descent. To my knowledge, still the only federal judge of Cape Verdean descent. He was a cranberry bog worker alongside his parents, who were immigrants from the island of Bravo. He did not finish high school because his parents were like, you need to work. We all need to work. But he somehow was able to get himself into college and then into law school, into college on scholarship, by the way. That's how smart he was. Into law school, and then became a federal judge in Illinois. So his story, I think, is significant enough to have here, and it's really a point of pride for the local Cape Verdean community. If you want to do this on a tour, we do have audio here where you can listen to song lyrics in Creole, which, even though Portuguese is the official language of Cape Verde, everyone's first language is Creole, which is a mix of African and Portuguese. And so we have songs in Creole, we have songs in Portuguese, we have songs in English and poems in English, just to give people a treat and so that they can hear the differences. Here's a reproduction of the panorama. We're going to be hitting a lot of these spaces on the balcony. Again, it goes from right to left, and so you've got New Bedford. That dark area is the Gulf Stream, stormy Gulf Stream. The Azores, Cabo Verde, right? And this is actually a section that is of that town, Cidade Velha, right? Fogo, Brava. You go back across the Atlantic to Brazil. After Brazil, because remember there was no Panama Canal, you had to go all the way to the southern tip of South America through the Cape Horn Passage, and then you hit the Pacific. Juan Fernandez Island, Pitcairn Island. Pitcairn is significant because Mutiny on the Bounty. Marquesas Islands, so this is Nukuhiva. This island is significant because it's where Melville jumped ship. He stayed there for a little while, and his book, Typee, is based on his time there. After leaving Nukuhiva and the Marquesas, right, Tahiti, Huahine, Hawaii, right, really significant at that time. Right whaling on the northwest coast, right, so sort of close to Washington state area. And then Fiji. Interesting thing, right, these are the rolls of the panorama we own. We were given the panorama in 1918. When we were given the panorama, we were missing the fifth roll. It has yet to be located. But if you think about a whaling voyage, many of them went back, right, around Africa from the Pacific, stopped in St. Helena, and then came back across the Atlantic to New Bedford. Next stop after Cape Verde was Brazil. And so one of the things that's pretty noteworthy here, right, we've got some traditional hunting implements. So these would be poison tipped, right? These are indigenous materials. But also, you know, if you look at the craftsmanship of this rolling pin, so whalemen often became artists on these voyages. You think about sailing for 4 years. You might see a whale every once in a while, but you might also go 2 or 3 weeks with nothing happening. And so what do? You produce scrimshaw, you whittle wood, right? And that improves over the course of the 4 years. So here we have a Brazilian rosewood rolling pin with scrimshaw handles. So here we have a map of Tierra del Fuego, which you would pass on your way to Cape Horn. I'm going to try and get out of the sun a bit. One of the most interesting things to me about Tierra del Fuego, and, you know, of course, the indigenous implements, the fact that they were hunting multiple species, often in competition or conflict with the Yankee whalers. But if you look through Yankee whaling journals, there was all this folklore and mythology about what the people of Tierra del Fuego were like, that they were these hairy monsters and they were, you know, 8 feet tall. And a couple of times I've come across references to the fact that whalers are very disappointed that they're just regular old people, you know, when they see them. So I love that we have that image from the book there. That book, by the way, is part of a series of books commissioned by the United States Navy by Lieutenant Wilkes. And so it was sometime in the mid-19th century, Wilkes said, whaling is so important to us as a nation that we need to make sure that we are protected in every port, in Brazil, in Hawaii, et cetera, where whaling is important. And so he went with some artists, with some botanists, with merchant seamen, et cetera, and followed the traditional path of a Yankee whaleboat. And so in the series of books, I think there are many, many volumes, and we have them in our reading room, but he just documented every port and described the flora and the fauna and the culture and the history, really, really comprehensive, all for the benefit of US military intervention if need be, but also science, right? So that we would know a little more about the world. The next geographically significant area that we're going to talk about is the Northwest Coast. And so we have many, many objects from that region. So again, around Washington state area. Here we have a potlatch. It's a blanket, but it was worn sort of as a cape, and I'll explain the meaning behind that in a second. If you turn to this case, we have a lot of implements or objects that are associated with potlatch. And so it's a word that we hear often, but I don't know that a lot of people who are not involved in anthropology know the actual meaning behind it. So excuse me if you do, and I'm explaining it all over again. Among Northwestern chiefdoms, so these were areas where there were different degrees of political power, different degrees of social power, often symbolized in the totem we have here, which would give you your lineage and your right to certain political power. Potlatches were ultimately a way of competing with neighboring groups, but also getting rid of surplus so you didn't have haves and have-nots. So during a potlatch ceremony, there would be this competitive feasting. If you were the chief of a neighboring tribe, I would say, bring your group over, bring your nation over, we're gonna feast you. And then I would try to shame you and outdo you by giving you so much that it just embarrassed you. And so there's this very famous quote of a Kwakiutl, which is one of the tribal nations there, Kwakiutl chief saying, "We don't fight with weapons, we fight with gifts. So I give you more than I ever think you could return to me. And then within a certain amount of time, you invite my group over, and you not only have to give me what I gave you, you have to give me more. Or else you're totally shamed and your group is useless and worthless." And so part of your job as chief is to knock on doors and make sure that everyone's putting into the pot. So I've described this in very economic terms. There was also a very important spiritual component to that. So a lot of the dances and ceremony that would take place during potlatch was to reciprocate your clan ancestors, to give thanks to the Creator and all of the animals that give themselves and all of the plants that give themselves for your sustenance. And so a lot of the objects we have here are part of that potlatch tradition, as was this. So if we could read this, it would give us the lineage of the person who wore it during the potlatch dance. Very similar concept to what we'll see when we get down to the Pacific. So one thing that I really harp on, and again, it's my bias as an anthropologist, is that these are not simply objects. These have their own spiritual energy, right, according to the people who use them. It's a concept we'll see as we get into the Pacific, which there is called mana. So there's mana in everything, and it determines whether that thing or that person is successful, useful, important, or completely useless. So if I have a club that has a lot of mana, I'm going to be a good warrior, right? As long as I have a lot of mana too. But if I don't have a lot of mana, and my club doesn't, because I didn't make it appropriately, or if I stole the material I used to make it, I will be unsuccessful. Same with these knives, scoops, etc. They have their own spiritual energy. Okay. big seal, totem. Again, if we knew how to read that, we'd know the identity and ancestry and political position of the person who had that in front of their home. So if you look to the window, we've got a panel here about the Portuguese in the Hawaii. To this day, if you go to Hawaii, there are a large number of Native Hawaiians who have Portuguese last names. So it was another area that the Portuguese were pretty prominent in, to the extent that the ukulele is really a modified Portuguese instrument. The braguinha is it's sort of like a mandolin. But the ukulele, which we so associate with Hawaii and Hawaiians, is actually Portuguese in origin. Hawaiian sweetbread. What other group of people has sweetbread? Portuguese, right? So, yeah, malasadas. And so really, really important in you might argue about the use of this word. I just mean the sort of structure and building of the development of the Hawaiian Islands. Really significantly, if you think about the sort of colonies or the lands that Portugal held onto around the mid-19th century into the early 20th century, Madeira wasn't doing so well. There were a lot of droughts, a lot of economic issues. Cape Verde wasn't doing so well. It was really poorly managed by the Portuguese. And so there was a wave of migration of Madeirans and Cape Verdeans to Hawaii because there were sugar plantations where there would at least be steady employment and steady income. And so here we really see the influence of the Portuguese in Hawaii as well. This case here, where Michael is standing, just has some objects from voyages around the Pacific. And again, you can see that box all the way on the right with the inlay and the beautiful wood carving. Probably, I don't know what it says on that label, but lots of objects like that were carved by whalers while on board. Another thing I should mention, if Mike Dyer didn't, we have our Scrimshaw gallery, right? Technically, and I did not know this until Mike told me, technically it's not considered Scrimshaw unless it's carved on board ship by a sailor. Right, so the people who would sit on the docks, that's not Scrimshaw. Lots of interesting things here, like tapa cloth, which was manufactured by women for chiefs, right, really important cloth, and seems to last forever. The chief curator is always asking us to take a look at it and if any damage has been done to it, and it's been an amazing shape, at least in the time I've been here, and I know since it's been on display. One of the more interesting objects in this case is this little object all the way to the left. So we cannot talk about voyages into the Pacific without talking about cannibalism, which was a big fear of Yankee whalers. When we think about Pacific Islander cannibalism, I think it's really important to note that it happened. It was not something that whalers necessarily had to fear, because usually cannibalism took place in the context of intertribal war on the islands, right? It was really spiritually significant. It was about sort of overcoming your opponents in warfare, etc. However, we do have a few tales of cannibals getting whalers. There is one story that's pretty significant. There was this captain he was in New Zealand, I believe, and he got upset with the chief from one of the groups and flogged him in front of everyone. The Maori didn't take too well to that. And so they killed everyone that was on the island, cannibalized them, put on their clothing, rowed out to the ship, killed everyone on board, burned the ship, and then they said, okay, now we're even. Now we can continue trading with these whale ships. And so it was really just about retribution for doing harm to their chief. But I put that in the context of When we think about the fear of cannibalism among Yankee whalers, the actual threat of cannibalism was nothing in comparison to the threat that whalers brought to these islands. So you think of alcohol, you think of diseases that they weren't immune to. You think of trade networks. So there are plenty of examples of captains that said, if you give me these goods, I'll trade X, Y, and Z, and then they sail off without compensating the people for what they've given. And so there was a lot of cultural disruption that went on, on the side of the islanders. But of course, when we talk about cannibalism, we can also reflect on the whale ship Essex, right? You've all heard of the Essex. The reason that they were at sea in the Pacific for 95 days when a whale hit their ship, right, inspiration for Moby Dick, whale hit the ship goes down. They get on 3 smaller boats, and they are very, very close to Tahiti. And when I say very close, like 1,000 miles. They're about 3,000 miles from the west coast of South America. But they make a decision, we're going to sail back to Chile because we don't want to end up in Tahiti and be eaten by cannibals. And so they're at sea for 95 days, and how do they survive? They eat each other as they're dying. Here are some, again, I hesitate to say objects, but we've got war clubs, we've got spears, we've got paddles, all according to the makers, with a certain level or certain degree of this quality called mana. And so again, if this dominated many enemies, it means that this club has a lot of mana, as does its user. But you can tell these aren't just utilitarian objects because of the elaborate carvings in them. Really, really beautiful work. The same with these objects here. The Arctic whaling disaster I referred to earlier is depicted right here. And so I believe it was 33 vessels, many of which, I think 20-something of them came from New Bedford. They shouldn't have been in the Arctic at that time because it was time for it to freeze over. 32 of the ships decided, 23 or 24 of the ships decided to go for it anyway because the water hadn't frozen over yet. The water froze over and they were trapped. The ships that stayed behind went to rescue them. Not the ships couldn't get through, but in smaller boats. All 1,200 or so people were rescued. There were no fatalities. However, to make room for all of the people that they rescued, they had to throw out all of their whale oil and baleen. And the thinking was, and I don't know that this was a thought at the time, but it definitely was a thought afterwards, the thinking was, we have insurance, we'll be paid for these things, and we saved all of these lives. Well, the insurance never paid for the lost items. And again, this was a crushing blow to the whaling industry, and I think one which never recovered from this. In addition, you've now got competition from petroleum. So the other thing that did New Bedford in specifically was the fact that if you think about the whaling route in the Atlantic and then the Pacific, the resources, meaning the whales, were pretty much depleted towards the end of whaling in the Atlantic. It no longer made sense to go to the Azores and then Cape Verde, except to pick up crew, right? But there really weren't the same number of whales there that were there 50 years earlier. And so all of the whales were in the Pacific. But in order to get to the Pacific from here, you have to go all the way around South America into the Pacific. 1849, everyone wants to be in California anyway because of the gold rush. And so California, in effect, because of the gold rush, because of railroads, now became the center of the whaling industry. In fact, a lot of people hopped on whale ships to get to California just because they wanted to go out there and look for gold. Right. So this case pretty much covers California and how they ruined whaling for New Bedford. It now became the center, but it just made more sense to ship out from there rather than from here. And I think the final nail in the coffin was that railroad. So now you had access to the Pacific, you had transportation, you had gold. We just couldn't compete with that. But we had textiles at that point, so New Bedford was still doing okay. So this last case here, interestingly enough, I never thought about it until this moment, but this is sort of where we start in cultures of whaling. So Inupiat culture, which was increasingly, as whaling resources, whales, especially right whales, were depleted, the Arctic became the place to hunt for right whales and get baleen, which became really important because there was no plastic and baleen worked in kind of the same way, really valuable commodity. And so as whalers were heading into the Arctic, they were influencing Arctic culture, even in traditional art. So these traditional carvings, traditional bone and scrimshaw carvings, now have Yankee guns and Yankee whaleboats on them, but became important trade items, right? We have some traditional masks here. We have some carvings, which you'll notice these in the culture of whaling exhibit. So some carving of seals, carvings of whales. Again, they weren't just toys or little implements. They were a way of reciprocating, of thanking that animal for giving itself to you by carving its likeness. And what you'll see in the cultures of whaling exhibit is these were often placed on top of harpoons or knives that were then used to hunt more seals that were then carved, right, for the same purpose. So very cyclical, right? But the main idea was giving thanks, because you weren't hunting the animal was giving itself to you. And then the final thing I'd like to point out in this exhibition is the hide right there that's stretched out with the drawing on it. If you look really closely at what's going on in that depiction, it is Arctic peoples doing a ceremony. They're holding these big, it looks like rubber balls over their heads as they're dancing. They are actually seal bladders. And what they're doing is they are dancing, they are thanking, they are praying, and then they throw those bladders back into the water so that the soul goes back to where it belongs. And so again, that idea of reciprocity, very, very important. Because if you stop doing things like this, they will stop giving themselves to you. Right? So a little bit of a different concept than Yankee whalers had.